Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, and welcome to our next Rebellious Research Seminar Series with a special, very special guest. I was really looking forward to this presentation. So I'm delighted here today to welcome Dafydd Sills Jones, who's going to be talking about unfolding creative media research, investigation and intuition in the age of big tech media. So Dafydd, the next hour or so is yours, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and then we're going to take some questions and answers after that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, yeah, I'll share, my presentation. Just let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, we can.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for the invitation. And I've got to say, I feel honoured and a bit more than a bit humbled to be part of a series, which is now, I think it's series 4, is it, of this franchise? And there's been some pretty illustrious names in this series, so I'm hoping I can live up to that. I'm associate professor at the School of Art and Design in AUT, Auckland University Technology in Auckland in New Zealand. And I'm also the director of a new research centre called the AUT Virtual Creative Design Research Centre. And what I want to talk about today is the idea of unfolding and using the idea of unfolding and some kind of sub-split ideas underneath it to try and look back at some stuff I've done in the past and also look at some stuff I'm doing in the present and think about what implications that kind of that idea and the kind of 3 ideas underneath it have for practice as research. To some extent, it's quite an exploratory idea, and it's popped up in a couple of other studies, which I'll talk about in a second already. And so it's evolving, and it's quite a loose idea in a way, but it's helped me in a few different ways over the years, and it's helping me now to think about continuity out of one mode of research into another. I think that's one way of thinking about it. So in the blurb for today, which I have to stick to some extent, but I'm also going to be drifting from, I'm afraid, like I said, this talk looks at making through media as a way of researching, and in that, obviously, what comes up is the ideas, the notions of autoethnography and craft. In an age where available technologies and dissemination platforms are dominated by proprietary tools and automated systems, I think it's also important to say that, in comparison to, I'm old enough to remember a different age when there weren't as many available texts, there weren't as many available platforms. This platform, for example, did not exist. I'm old enough to remember that. So actually, there's a lot of pluses to that situation as well. So it's not just a deficit situation, and it's something that needs careful thinking through, I think, when we step onto these platforms and use them. First of all, and I think maybe most importantly, is this like an idea of selfhood and creativity, which is central, I think, to all kinds of notions of practice research. And so in that, we can think about tensions around what some people might term subjectivity or objectivity. So autoethnography is often critiqued for blurring the line between personal experience and academic analysis, or autoethnographers integrate their subjective experiences into research. The challenge lies in maintaining a balance between personal narrative and scholarly rigor. We get these kind of criticisms for practice research all the time. There's also questions of authenticity and ethical implications of self-representation. So if you're making a film to some extent, or a piece of media to some extent about yourself, then there are other people probably also involved in that projection of yourself. And so there are some ethics that arise out of that. There's also the question of identity being fluid and changing. So I definitely feel that in myself, that my selfhood is quite fluid and has changed over the years. And over the examples I'm going to show here, that I think you can see that happening. So again, when you're looking back at something that's been done a few years ago, do things change in terms of the text itself sort of departing from me as a self? There's also things like power dynamics and voice involved. If you're in a powerful position, such as, you've got a tenured position at a university, you're able to kind of speak with a certain power. Maybe you need to kind of be thinking about how that works. As well as interpersonal boundaries and relational ethics with other people might be involved, and also the role of emotion in knowledge production. What is the role of emotion in knowledge production? It's quite easy to think, perhaps from a positivist, scientific point of view, that there's no role. At the same time, perhaps you need to kind of balance that or temper it to some extent. You can get what Anderson calls sort of emotional overload in some aspects of autoethnography. So again, that's something to kind of try to judge as you're going along. Anyway, there are all kinds of things to talk about around selfhood or creativity in practice research. The second thing, there's somebody just arrived. The second thing is thinking about craft, and thinking about, as we do with media, inevitably we're talking about electronic media, we're talking about technology of some kind or other. So we're kind of thinking through, to some extent, actor network theory type ideas around craft. So I might well have a skill that I have developed or been able to acquire, but that skill is distributed between me and my tools, and the tools that I've got are to some extent not mine. I didn't make them. They might well have their own agency, which is like a huge subject of discussion at the moment with AI. But even if it's a camera, that has its own agency, it has its own limitations, it makes me do things, it makes things that I didn't think would happen, etc. There's also the question of craft knowledge versus theoretical abstraction, which I think is a really big deal in our area, where quite often we're asked to be theoretically abstract about something and to leave craft knowledge behind. We're quite often trying to find ways of justifying craft knowledge, justifying haptic knowledge, somatic knowledge. This is in the kind of context of network practices and individual enterprise. So in the social encasement, if you like, of capitalism and of the technologies that come from it and the processes that come along with that system. And then maybe another way of talking about it is the balance between tradition and innovation as well. So there are all kinds of things to be thinking about when making practices research, as we tend to do, with tools that are technological and on platforms that are global and owned by somebody else in some way or other. So there's loads to talk about there. Could probably go on for a bit longer about that, but I don't want to go on too much about those things, because I think maybe we can talk about that later on. This brings me to the idea of unfolding. So unfolding became quite a useful way of trying to discuss these ideas without getting too bogged down in them, because just from those two slides I've gone through, and in fact, as I'm going through my notes, I'm going, wow, I could go on about that for a bit longer, or that for a bit longer. There's an enormous amount to talk about. And when you're doing practices research, when I'm doing practices research, I'm quite aware of the kind of oversupply of findings. It's an oversupply of meaning, an oversupply of semiosis, an oversupply of all kinds of things. Quite the opposite to the very traditional scholarly model of being a one research question that leads off in directions afterwards. It's kind of almost the opposite of that. So trying to contain and balance and remember all these things can be quite paralyzing for me, I find anyway. So the idea of unfolding came about through a couple of different contexts. The first one, where it came from, was a study that conducted in AUT with Dr. Rufus McEwen and Dr. Anna Jackson, when we did a study of teaching media production across universities. We actually did a large survey of universities in Europe, in the UK, in Australia and New Zealand, looking at the new kind of hackable media and the ease of new platforms, the ease of new cameras, the ease of new editing systems, and how that had changed the way the media was thought about, media production was thought about, and also the way that a priori knowledge by students coming in to the university changed the way that teachers needed to think about the way they would teach. And unfolding there came as an easy way to, or the easier way to think of unfolding the implications of different kind of media, slowly unfolding something and seeing what was there, because we were finding that we had a great deal of assumptions about what was there and that needed challenging. But at the same time, we wanted to, I guess, hold on to the fact that the possibilities were greatly increased. And there were some fantastic new possibilities for students at higher education in media, the ability to make all kinds of texts that they hadn't been able to do before, and also a speed of understanding with certain types of technology that students came with that they didn't come before. So there were a lot of possibilities there as well. So we were trying to unfold things instead of sort of just taking them as they were. We then further developed that idea in a recent article with Max Schlieser, who I believe was just before me on the series, and where we applied that particularly to mobile media, that idea, in order to think through again the implications of the balance between technology and democratization that is kind of at the heart of mobile media. So the idea of mobile media, that you could carry your phone around in your pocket and you can do all kinds of things with it. It gives you, it's a kind of a, you know, it's an amazing sort of Swiss Army knife of the 21st century. But also, of course, it does limit you. There are all kinds of implications about mental health that we know, especially with younger people. So that there were pluses and minuses that we want to unfold there. So the background to the idea of unfolding in these studies was around things like student agency. And when I say this, I think it reverberates for us as researchers as well. I mean, and I think one of the implications here was that maybe we're all becoming students to some extent. The speed of technological change meant that we were all having to learn new softwares, new equipment every semester, if not every year. And so there was student agency and staff agency was becoming a bigger issue. It wasn't the same old story of good and bad tech. We had to kind of look past that, because sometimes some tech was bad in some ways and good in other ways. Good and bad was formulated in different ways by different people, etc. We were thinking about how technology defined humanity and to what extent it does. We thought about structures that afforded freedom of action, somewhat, and sometimes didn't. We were thinking about technology as being culturally relative, and with that, just a disaster or war away from evaporating. And as we were doing this work, it was just before COVID, which it's kind of hard to remember fully by now in a way, but the impact of COVID when it actually happened, when the lockdowns happened, was very similar to that, a kind of a technological sort of break around the world. And that the agency that we have of these technologies has always been negotiated to some extent. Some of it you'll reach a locked door. At other times, you know, you can go through that door and it gives you all kind of possibilities. And we came to the conclusion, I think, that top-down methods didn't work anymore. Or do they? So I think there's definitely a lot of stuff in the pedagogic circles at the moment about returning to a kind of more, in inverted commas, more traditional mode of teaching around instruction, etc., especially if people were feeling that they're overwhelmed by detail. But all these conversations were coming out of this discussion about teaching and about students, because the background of the situation was and is, I think, to a large extent, ubiquitousness of the digital, of the mobile, of AI, that we have digital natives and changing literacies. So what was once thought as a literacy, you know, was or a little illiteracy was now a literacy. Very rapid movements in media production. We were still coping with that maker craft and brand worlds that Caldwell talked about in 2016, with the big distance away from the kind of DIY culture of YouTube, or maybe what we're doing now, and a large budget film in Hollywood. The distance between those things became further and further and further than had been, say, in the 90s. action was still happening in the mysterious meso layer of media production. So in that management area, management of resources, which we'll come back to at the end of this talk as well, management of resources being part of the research process to some extent. How to balance preparation, reflection, and change with legacy media and legacy methods became a really important thing that we were thinking about. And how to think about equity in an age of higher education where time is precious. So we came up with sort of 3 ways really of trying to subdivide this idea of unfolding, because unfolding, yeah, you unfold the piece of paper, you unfold the situation, you unfold the narrative, whatever. You could go on and on and on, but we were thinking about 3 main ways of unfolding what we were doing. And I'll use the mobile media examples just to explain a little bit more fully these 3 models of unfolding. First one's rolling out, the second is uncrinkling, and the third is picking process. So the first one is kind of like a classic reflective practice, but the familiarity of the mobile device leads us to be able to do this. The ubiquity of its use and its functions, the ease and speed and convenience of its use. And using a mobile device can reveal the ontological positioning of making media, even in legacy broadcasting, because of its speed and familiarity. So there's something about the mobile that enables us to see very quickly what's going on, and using it could outline the ontological position of making media with a mobile. So rolling out was kind of looking in more depth critically at what you're doing, in a way, a quite basic, classic reflective practice. The second was uncrinkling. So this was looking at how mobile works within an ecosphere, zooming in on specific detail. So thinking about a kind of crinkled piece of paper and then uncrinkling it, then actually unfolding it, but then finding all kinds of creases, all kinds of small, difficult to explain areas of concentration and intersection. This could include differing and sometimes contradictory ways in which mobiles can be deployed. The world of free hackable apps. So the way that you can move a piece of media from one app to another, to another, to another, sort of mediating as you go and building up layers of mediation. And then meshing with more complex computer-led media making systems. For example, things you could do with GitHub. And then the third one, picking process. So this was experimentation. Does not instantly change the world. This is when we come crashing down to reality to some extent. We live in a world of media giants, Apple, Adobe, Canon, Google, OpenAI, etc. And Meta, probably I should add there as well. We have to learn how to navigate our mobile device through these. And for students particularly, this was really important, which and if you're working higher education, which technology do you buy when? And trying to buy a camera that's going to work for the next 3 or 4 years is very, very hard. And especially the expense, you don't get to buy them very often. If you're buying a set for your department, how on earth do you make that decision? You have to navigate to some extent through these proprietary systems, because also your students will want a job afterwards. They'll want to know how to use these things in the economy outside of research. This is also true to some extent for us as researchers as well. So that's the tripartite rolling out, uncrinkling, and picking process, unfolding media sort of idea. And I guess this is a quote here from the article with Max Schleser, that rolling out engages in broader social cultural outlooks, such as the creative ecosystem, continues to investigate the complexities surrounding particular projects. Uncrinkling then furthers development through understanding complexity, and then the unpicking is looking at the real situation pragmatically, but with the decentralized attitude within a hierarchical system. How can we make the best of the Adobe license we've got within our institution, for example, or how could we make the best of the free apps we've got? Okay, right. So I've got to the end of the bit about unfolding and how it developed through a couple of projects. How does it apply to creative practice research, I hear you ask? Well, that's what I'm going to try and do today, which is a slight new evolution of it. I'm going to kind of think it through in these ways, perhaps. So in media practice research, these terms can be used to map out a trajectory from unstructured creativity, unrolling, let's say, through refinement, uncrickling to the practical application of industry standard tools. We could think of it in that terms. We could also think, which I think that's got a limited, we could also think about rolling out as examining media through making media, uncrinkling as taking a step then towards putting a bit more meaning and structure overall onto something. And I've got an example of an adaptation and the study around focalization to think about uncrinkling with. And then picking process, I definitely think we come closer then to having to cope with the realities of working with the new technologies that we want to be talking about. The fact that AI is here, the fact that virtual production is here, I think there are big implications for those two changes. Maybe not all good, but certainly not all bad. We need to live to some extent in those worlds, in the positions that we have in the universities that we're in or the industries that we're in. So we kind of need to work out what we're going to do about it. So the picking process becomes this kind of living with legacy media to some extent. And I think all three of them form a kind of methodological eclecticism, which is an approach that involves drawing a range of methods from different disciplines, adapting and combining them to suit the research content. And in media practice research, this approach can be valuable as it allows for flexibility, incorporating creative practice and academic theory to produce rich and nuanced insights. Sometimes it's not quite easy to know how to do that without either abandoning intuition or becoming so inquisitive and investigational that you kind of become a sort of a kind of detective of some kind, and you lose the emotion out of the situation altogether. So it's that balance. This simple structure is there to try and preserve that. So now comes the bit where I'm trying to apply this the structure onto research, which is a bit harder to do, but I'm going to try. So the rolling out. So I would say that there's evidence looking back at some of the work I've done in the past on my ongoing explorations of documentary modes. There's definitely evidence there of me having been rolling out in terms of my methodology across those projects. So unrolling can represent, or rolling out can represent, the initial stage of exploration and experimentation where critical ideas are worked through by engaging directly with the medium. This phase emphasizes the creative and generative process of media practice, wherein ideas evolve through hands-on making. Unrolling is about opening up possibilities and engaging the production of meaning, often in response to specific questions or theoretical frameworks. And this stage, aligns very closely with practice-led research, where making is central to developing and testing critical ideas. And that's what I was doing really with this clutch of projects that I've been doing since, good Lord, 2010, looking at a different aspect of documentary, testing it by playing it out in a different context to what it would usually be done. So the first one, for example, was looking at how interviews could be broken up and reassembled in order to get the kind of cadences of people's voices to work together. I can show you a clip of that in a minute. Suburban Symphony, which was using a flaneur technique to create short films that came straight out of musical structures. At Gors, the Bog, again, using musical composition and community participation with a community choir. At Dosbarth Melyn, the Yellow Classroom, was about looking very carefully at the ontology of observational documentary filmmaking. So what did that make me do, that position of being an observational filmmaker, and to what extent that helped or hindered what I would want to do. Trydydd Mask, the Third Mask, is a 360 film, mask film about immersiveness and identity. And the last one, which actually strays a little bit into uncrinkling, so I might leave that until in the next section, was a film made on mobile. We're heavily thinking about mobile media at the time, adaptation and performance. So what I'm going to do is I'm 24 minutes in, right? Okay, what I'm going to do is I've got to go through a couple of these and just talk about the balance between intuition and investigation in these rolling out projects to try and put a finger on this rolling out mode. So the first one I want to talk about is POUTH. Who is TH? This was the first one I did really back in 2010, and I was doing my probation at Aberystwyth University, and Professor Adrian Keir said, you must do practice as research. And I'm like, oh my Lord, what is that? So I very quickly found out what that was, and I embarked into it. I'd had a career previously in media making, so it wasn't that strange to me, but this was the first time I did a research project through it. And the idea was to get people to speak, to voice their favourite poem by the Welsh poet T.H. Parry Williams, and then to be interviewed about them, to speak about that choice, and then to arrange that speaking in a kind of choir formation. So you see all these screens and these pictures here. There were about 12 of these channels all playing at the same time. So if you stood in the middle, you could hear 2 or 3 of them maybe at the same time. But if you stood back a bit, you could hear like a choir of cadences around this poet, almost like bringing that poet back into existence through a contemporary audience. I can play you a little bit of this now.
I'm afraid we don't hear it. David, we cannot hear it. We cannot hear it.
Ah, you can't hear it.
No.
Okay, hold on. I'm going to end the show. I'm going to reshare.
Yeah, thank you.
Hold on.
We tested it. We know it works.
We did. Oh, yes, it didn't. It wasn't there. That crucial button wasn't pressed the second time. Right.
I think it's under.
We've got it. Okay. Give me a chance to. Yeah, I'll go back. Right, here you go. Actually, give me. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Gartref yn Arfon, lle nid oes ond sŵn y gwynt ar afon a man donau'r llyn, a gweithiau gyfarth sydyn, cryg y cwn busneslyd, pan eol rhywun dros y bryn. Gartref yn Arfon, lle nid oes ond falio, pa beth am neol. I weld y teithio'r tafod, mae bron wrth edrych ar sŵn ar y wlad.
Okay, so I think that gives you an idea of the effect of that piece, although a bit crude. In terms of inspiration, there was a couple of texts that had made me think about doing this in this way. One particularly was Janet Cardiff's recreation of the Talus Spem in Allium motet, which she put speakers all around the outside of the room. And then the only place you could hear this piece, this amazing 16th century piece of music, was in the middle. But when you're in the middle, you really can't hear anything, have a wash of sound. If you go to any speaker in particular, then you can hear parts of the piece in harmony. And it is a very encoded piece that was written in a period where there was a great deal of religious repression. So it's a fascinating piece of music and fascinating piece of history around it. And I then just before doing this, was in a choir and I sang the piece, and the experience of that made me think about ancestry and language and identity in a certain way. And then that was when I sort of thought, like, let's do this then. Then after that, of course, there were all kinds of technical problems and investigations to undertake. And a colleague in Aberystwyth, T. Robin Chapman, helped me then make sense of what we'd done. So again, that was a really interesting balance for me then at the first time out, in terms of a balance between intuition and investigation with the technology at the center. And this was an early piece for me, and in fact I had a professor from the department come down and check that it worked. It did work as practice as research, which was also very interesting, an interesting experience, because there was from a sort of positivist written scholar kind of point of view, which maybe I was having before, a real indeterminacy as to whether it was working, as to whether it counted, as to whether it was research, as to whether it was new knowledge, or, as Professor Pearson said, whether it worked or not. And he says it does work. So that was very interesting for me, because I got the sense of these two things going together, of this kind of this investigative and intuitive thing moving at the same time. And really, there's no way of explaining what the knowledge was being produced there, except really in the work. I'll go on to the next slide, if I may. The next one, a couple of years later, was on a sabbatical in Helsinki, where I just walked around the forests and listened to certain recordings, and then used that as a basis for filming things in the suburb, and then produced a series of short films that came from that experience. Okay, so that was It was made well before Tenet, so that all the things are going backwards. That all came from viewings of Herzog, and what I'd felt with particularly Lessons of Darkness and a couple of other films of his was this kind of emptiness and slowness, and as well as being able to reverse time, which came to me as a kind of device that I could use to examine being somewhere that I'd never been before, but feeling completely at home there in a way I'd never felt or have ever felt since, actually, to be honest. A very, very strange feeling of being at home in this place. And also knowing that I could not be there for very long. Again, technologically, what was interesting there was his DSLR. You might have seen me for the DSLR on the train earlier on, and it was kind of tapping into that at that time where DSLRs gave you quite amazing look for not much money, and they were incredibly portable, incredibly usable, and that sort of allowed me to be able to do that kind of flaneur work, but with a certain kind of aesthetic, which I'm not quite sure if it comes across in that video with the quality there. So again, the balance between the intuition and the technology was really interesting. The investigation of it was about place and about a sensation of place. So it was possible to do that through a kind of flaneur method, but also the intuition of feeling a certain rhythm of picture to go with a certain piece of music. So I'd listen to these pieces of music, which are Shostakovich preludes, as I would walk around Helsinki, the suburbs, and that used that as a way of deciding what to film and then how to edit. So next example of unrolling. And I think it's fair to say you could probably detect there's a little bit of uncrinkling and maybe even a bit of packing pathways happening already as well. So to say this is all unrolling maybe isn't right. And as I was writing this, I was going, oh, damn it, they're going to spot that. So I'll just admit it right from the start. But what I think what's interesting here, just to kind of see that I think there's a kind of a shift in this work. So this was this was funded by the HRC Hydro Citizens project, and it was a local choir that lived on the edge of a bog near where I used to live, really huge, big old peat bog, about sort of 7,000 years old. That was kind of dead and alive at the same time as peat bogs are, and this kind of massive carbon store. And so I and Marie Cartier and Tim Jones also worked together on creating a film that came out of music written by the film's composer for the choir. So he conducted the choir, he was the only person that wrote music for the choir. They lived next to the bog. So there was this kind of very different way of trying to create the text. The reason why we wanted to do that was because it was a very controversial piece of land. Farmers wanted to dry it out, burn it, shoot any sort of foxes that were living on it, etc., for all the reasons that you could imagine. And then there was also a conservation community, mostly that had moved in from outside of the area and outside of Wales, who were interested in keeping it because of its importance in terms of biodiversity. So you had this very interesting polarity between these two positions. And we used the music and composition within the piece to kind of suspend that polarity so that you could have those two poles next to each other, side by side, almost kind of coexisting. Whereas in the situation, it was quite difficult to make a film about that. Although in the reality, people did live that mixed paradoxical reality. I'll show you a little bit of this.
It's a national nature reserve, so it's an area that's been bought by the state because it's deemed to be of very high conservation value, but also within Europe it's designated as a special area of conservation. It's designated as an internationally important wetland site. It's called a Ramsar site. So just gives you some idea of the importance of the site, not just nationally but internationally. And because of its undamaged nature, particularly in the central area, then it's been really important for researchers to look at various things. Experiment, heating it passively by putting this shield, pumping water out of here to drop air temperature at different depths, decomposition rate, evapotranspiration, methane production. If you took samples of the peat, say from several meters down, scientists can get information about the climate 2,000 years ago.
Cau y ffosil o wedi cael ei hagor o blaen, maen wedi cau ar hynny, maen nhw eisiau codi lefel y bog fyny. Maen nhw'n gadael yn y ffordd maen nhw ddim yn ei llosgu, i gael y tofiant cymryd nôl a ffydru a'i chodi fyny, a dwi'n yn gwybod i beth dda.
Ond erbyn hyn wrth gwrs, mae'n warchodfa natur. Mae bywyd natur, dych chi'n bod, Dafydd, yn ardderchog. Ond mae rhaid i chi gadw bywyd natur o dan reolaeth. Ac yn ôl marn ni, mae wastraff arian llwyr.
So believe it or not, that little clip there with the chord, that was one of our main findings, was that it was possible to kind of have that quite massive difference in opinion, a philosophical, cultural, linguistic difference of position, but they could live next to each other within the composition of a film because, to some extent, the music allowed that, but also because the community were part of the production of it. And some members of the choir were, on one side or the other, and those discussions would happen within that choir as well. So instead of having it played out in that way, we did it in this way. So again, in terms of technology and intuition, or in terms of investigation intuition, this was then a bit more complicated. There was a team of us doing this, and there was a choir doing it. And so the intuition was working on a very different level, where there was a kind of collective consciousness, if you like, at work in the choir and within the team that we were working at. And so in terms of investigation, we had to think about certain musical principles, certain editing principles, in order to suspend judgment, suspend meaning, have longer phrases of meaning overlapping each other within the film. But again, the result was this. So again, it's interesting, I think, that the investigation and intuition sort of come together and blend into each other. I'll just skip over that bit. These are the sub-questions of a course.
No, don't skip. We have plenty of time.
No, don't skip. We've got plenty of time. Okay. So this is then how it was. This is then how it was articulated for Screenworks. So the other two I've shown you that they were published, but not in Screenworks. And I think getting this into Screenworks was, a really big moment for me as a practice researcher, because Screenworks was at the time, still is, really important platform. And getting into it, be able to understand and be really confident about how that statement will work for them, again, was a development for me, I think, of how you get these two things to go along next to each other. So you can see the sub-questions there. How can non-realist documentary film language be deployed without alienating the community and about whom the film is made, and the likely wider audience for the film? Well, actually, an insolvable problem there that is inherent to documentary of insider-outsider positions. But, that's the part of the paradox of that form. And that the musical composition techniques, part of which were community-based, could enable that balancing. And I think, it did to some extent, and at some extent it didn't. So that was a successful piece of research, I think. I go on to another example. Then this example was of a primary school in West Wales, actually in a village right next to the bog as well. And this was really about trying to think about what it was to be an observer, particularly an observer, observational documentary maker in that mode, but somebody who did have a very specific angle on what was going on in the school. So this was a month-long shoot, every day, all day for a month, which is reasonably long for a 10-minute film. And I could show you a clip of this.
Meddyliwch, mae 7 yn y pen a chi'n cyfri mlaen 7. 7 yn y pen, 8, 9, 10. So bydd yr ateb ati? 2 iawn. Fynd y pedwar ti'n mynd i'r ymwneud? 2 iawn. Gas? Diolch. Reit, 14.
Ble ydw i angen light hwnna?
Yn y bocs bach.
Yn hwnna?
Ie. Yn ti?
Yn fawr neu'n fach?
Ie, mae'r llwyth yn y ses. So bydd ti'n neud bach yn llai falle. Ie, Freddie, dangos i Oban.
Fel yna Oban.
Yn ti? Diolch. 3, 4, 4. Yn ti de? Ie. Pob eilrif. 2, ie. 2. Na, eilrif, you're fine. Pa eilrif ysa, 90. Reit, Alexa. Mae 7 i ffwrdd yn hwyr, ta'n marc y dim sy'n rhaid hwyr. Lan o'r law. Reit, ydych chi'n sylw pawb yn please, os mae tipyn o'ch chi'n stuck. So, na, dim miss o'ch chi'n bryd. Dawel. So mae miss yn dewis rhif 7 a 6, ok? 7 a 6 o'r rhif. Ok? Hwna yw un rhif y miss dewis. Felly, chi dangos i fi sy'n hwn wedi cael ei sgwennu llyfrau hefyd ar papur. Beth yw hanner y 70? What is half the 70? So hanner y 70 yn beth? Beth yw e? 35, diolch. A beth yw hanner y 6? Half the 6. So 10, 11, 10, 11. So beth yw hanner y 6? Righty. So beth yw'r ateb? 30? Beth yw 5? A just 3. Oi, diolch Hanley. So hwnna yw hanner 76.
So I had to let the scene go for a couple of reasons, I think. I think you can see one of the contexts there was kids mostly in an English-speaking community learning Welsh at school. So that was one of the issues, as it were, that I was looking at. And my kids were in that school as well. One of the boys around the table is now much bigger than that. But obviously I'm a Welsh speaker, so I had, I was kind of quite worried about whether they would learn and how they would learn and how it was going, and I was a parent there, etc. And it was very interesting to experience making that film through a quite strict observational documentary kind of set of rules, direct cinema type thing, with the test to see whether that would enable me to detach myself, or whether my detachment was impossible or actually was not really desirable. So again, it was a really interesting mix of investigation and intuition. We're putting intuition right into the middle of the investigation and trying to block the intuition to a certain extent. The finding was that the intuition was really essential, because actually there was so much work going on there that wasn't technical, that wasn't direct cinema rule based. You know, this pan, staying on that person for that long, you know, waiting for the right moment, and then the selection of scenes and the shaping of scenes, etc. That there was so much in there that was outside of the rules. But there was a relationship between that kind of strict meter, if you like, of direct cinema and the kind of emotions that came along with it. So again, this was a International Journal of Creative Media Research. Hooray. More about that later. Production. And it was I've got another detail in this slide, I think. Yes. Looking at voice, particularly, look at Scannell's idea of communicative intentionality, realist documentary, observational, selfhood, ontological positioning, fluidity, etc. in the making of this film. So I think by now I could see I was getting used to this kind of rolling, unrolling, or rolling out kind of exercise. But I think you also can see that I'm actually going into some of the details of something like observational documentary here, and really looking at some of the creases. So I'm cheating. This is not rolling out anymore. This is uncrinkling to some extent as well. Although I think looking at the kind of wider picture of documentary still sort of makes it a rolling out. Okay, so the last of these unrolling projects. Do tell me if I'm going on too long with these projects. No?
No, not at all. Take your time. It's fine.
This was a 360 film driven by the move from UK to New Zealand and the kind of exile of that, feelings of kind of hiraeth, a Welsh word for longing, and for dislocation. The idea was the technology that the 360 mask and that feeling came together straight away. That is, how do you remain connected to places? Well, you make them virtual places. Very easy to say, very difficult to do. Actually, let's challenge that a bit, and let's challenge the grammar around 360 films. And there was a bit of nascent bit of literature around it at the time, particularly Kath Dooley's work and Miriam Ross's work, actually, around this kind of filmmaking, which I found very interesting and useful. So right from the start, this was quite investigative. And then I deliberately turned it into something that was a bit more arty. It's quite hard to read that because this is a YouTube rendering of a 360 environment. And we haven't got masks, so we can't watch it.
2018, gadael eto. Y trydydd ymadawiad i'r chweched bywyd. Nôl ymlaen, Cymru a Lloegr, cynghenidra ac alltudiaeth. Dau bersonoliaeth, dau bwrpas. Dau fasg fel rhai Ezra. Gwleiddra gwerinol, deallustra trefol. Nôl ymlaen. Llais y galon, llais y pragmatydd. Rhythm goroesiad oesol y Cymru. Y tro yma mae'n wahanol, ond yn debyg. Cyrraedd glannau estron sy'n ymdebygu, coed, defaid, bryniau gwrddion, tric trefdadaeth arddodol, wedi fy anwytho, recrwt i luoedd y baceha, conquistadorau Aotearoa. Byw dawn nawdd a chysgod, iaith, baner, diwylliant yr hen ymerodraeth, a'r drail y cynghenid, yn naturiol y cyfiawn. Tramwyo'r tirwedd newydd, fy hen fasgau deiblyg yn drysu, stori gysur yr ysglyfaeth yn gymysg â gwacter y gwladychwr, pragmatiaeth y proffesiwn wedi dewis ochr arall y geiniog. Ond mae galwad yr hen diriogaeth, fy milltir sgwâr chwedlonol, yn aflonydd dan arwyneb profiad, pob cam, pob munud yn adlais, o gartre sydd erbyn hyn dan donau ar wahanrwydd ac angof. prosesau yrydol yn esblygu ar hyn a adawyd ar ei ôl. Fe es yn ôl am wythnos yn 2019, rhyw fath o ffyrlo o'r ffront. A oes modd mynd yn ôl nawr eto, a'n nghanol y pla, heb fynd. Ail gysylltu ar ddeiar gwreiddiol, masg newydd hudol yn gaddo uniongyrchedd, cysylltiad ar draws y cyfandiroedd, y drydedd masg. Hiraeth naif neu neshad rhythwyr, cawn weld, cawn glywed, cawn deimlo, ond oes fod dychwelyd i'r llenyddwch, oes modd sefyll ar y ddeiar. Y ddinas.
There you go. Okay, so in a way with this one, what happened first was the kind of the technical, and then afterwards was a kind of was more the intuitive. If it's possible, if it still makes sense to make that split as I'm talking about this series of works. So as you see on the list down there, the poetic inquiry was a really important aspect of the theoretical framework for this, as was Eric Crudson's marvelous idea of necessity, I think, in his book, from his book about personal filmmaking. This kind of hunt for a feeling or a necessity or a drive or something like that. That's not a, I don't think that's subjective. I think that is a real thing. I think you can feel it. It's a physical thing that you feel, and there's plenty of writing for 100 years now or more about drives and psychology, etc., that backs that stuff up. So I think you can identify that and you can work with it. And that was on this occasion, there's those two, the technological, investigative, and the poetic and inspirational kind of were really intermingled in a way that I thought, for me, worked really well. Bit over the top, perhaps. I was maybe a bit harsh on myself and my locale, but I was doing a certain kind of persona here as well, which I think was a move away from earlier work. Anyway, so rolling out, I mean, just looking back over these things. So my ongoing explorations of documentary modes, I think in terms of intuition, you know, I was generating ideas. I was embarking on creative explorations. I was very hands-on intuitively. And investigation you could think about in terms of theories and technologies and teams. But actually, just from those examples I've gone through, they are almost immediately intermingled with each other in terms of intuition and investigation. And, you know, the other part of this talk really is about big tech, which I haven't got onto big tech yet. I've got a little bit time left, or we'll go on to that in a bit. But big tech is already in the background here, right? We're talking about Premiere, we're talking about Adobe, we're talking about Canon, we're talking about SD cards, we're talking about 360 cameras, we're talking about masks. So all of those things are there. And none of this would be happening if they weren't there. I'd probably just be writing it and reading it to somebody or singing it or something. So those things are already part of the picture, but they become more so when we go to talk about uncrinkling. Okay, so we've already been doing some uncrinkling. I think it's some of those examples, but it sort of implies smoothing out the rough edges of early experiments, refining techniques, beginning to address specific challenges as constraints. It's about refining and focusing. It's ideas beginning to coalesce, become more defined, perhaps as pieces of work rather than kind of just sort of stumbling around. Concepts are becoming more clarified, perhaps, in the work because take a more focused direction. The idea of iteration in design and readers' practice, where practitioners cycle between making, reflecting, and refining, that kind of cycle starts actually sort of taking on some momentum. Also speaks to the process of conceptual narrowing, maybe, where broad ideas are honed into more concrete, specific approaches that could be further explored, presented. It's kind of this zooming in. And the example I wanted to use when talking about that was this, which is a project I've been doing for 3 or 4 years now with a colleague at Aberystwyth University, Dr. Roger Owen. And we've been looking at a Welsh novel written in 1979 called Cathlogion, and we've been reimagining it, adapting it through various different media. You can go to the site if you like. It is there, and it has different links to these different types, and every now and then we stick a new one up. It's based on the 1979 novella by Gareth Jones, who happens to be my father. So there is an autobiographical element still in that work, or the autoethnographical. We did a translation, which was really interesting, and all kinds of questions come up through that translation of audience, but also of period, also of tone, also of, to be honest, sorry, Dad, if you're listening somehow, he's not longer with us, unfortunately, but you never know, of incomplete narrative arcs, of some representations that were of their time and perhaps wouldn't be written that way now. There are all kinds of issues like that emerged out of this translation project. So instead of having a kind of adaptation which traditionally would be reductive, right? Reductive, traditionally you've got a big book and you have to make a 2-hour film. This was an explorative and sort of evolutionary or explosive type of adaptation, where we made more things than there was in the source media. A film script came out of it as well. The film script was became a very strange animal indeed. All kinds of things we had to invent in order to try and get into Film Cymru's script program, none of which unfortunately were successful, but we invented a kind of self-aware forest, and GM experiments went wrong, and there was a train that came and got the food for the city every week, and all kinds of sci-fi things that we invented to put into the book in order to try and get at some of the unlocked material potential in it in a new form. The same went for Roger's interactive game that he made with a mixture of Post-its and PowerPoint, and before going into other software, where there were speculations about the characters, and therefore also that the relationship between character and theme and background became really important. And then we make a vertical film, which I'm going to show you in a second. We made a devised post-theatrical performance of bits of the novel, all cut up and performed in different rooms in a building, as if parts of the book had been interviews made after arresting the characters. There's an AI podcast, which is a quite alarming 10-minute review of the book by AI. There's a Coast film on the way, and an AI mockumentary also in the pipes. So with other things as well. But this idea of trying to work out all the crinkles in this very gnomic and sort of mysterious book was behind all of these. Now, one of the examples was this film, Esgair Fraith, which means speckled ridge. It's a farm in a forestry commission area. It's an abandoned farm, and in the book itself there's an off-grid community that's secret. They make themselves known to the city for some strange reason, but never worked out why they've done it. The city says, well, we can't have them, and comes and destroys the off-grid community. So this has echoes of that place. It's a kind of as if maybe this is where this happened some years ago. And Roger went and recorded and performed a reading of the poem, and I filmed him on a mobile phone and recording the sound with another mobile phone. We can have another look at a clip of that. Right, take one. A bwyd y wal. A bant ni.
Y rhedau sy'n gyflymach ac yn gyflymach rhwng y coed, a'i gweld nhw yn fflachio heibio i mi trwy gornel fy llyged. Roedd fel pe bawn i'n redeg mewn hunlle rhag ryw ddrygioni mawr, ond yn redeg i ddim pwrpas. Roedd y drygioni o'n cwmpas i, mhobman, nid yn unig y tu ôl i mi, ond o'n blaen i, uwchben, o bobti, ym mhobman. Pwy oedd wedi gwneud y penderfyniad yn y lle cyntaf? Mike? Steffan? Yr hen ŵr ei hun, wyddwn ni ddim. Doeddwn ni ddim yn perthyn i'r cylch mewnol o wneud benderfyniadau droson ni ar yr adegau hynny pan nad ellid casglu'r holl gymuned at ei gilydd. Ond fe ddylai'r gymuned i gyd fod wedi trafod peth fel hyn. Ond ei penderfyniad i bawb ohono ni oedd e. Pam nad o'n i ddim wedi clywed sôn am y peth yn y cyfarfodydd cyffredinol?
Picaresque. Gawn ni weld beth sy'n digwyddaidd. Gawn ni sortio fy lapel allan. Mae'n nhw dan fyna.
Ala Tristram Shandy, ie?
Ie.
Ti'n gweld y ffilm na?
Do, y peth ohono fe, beth Steve Coogan, Rob Brydon, ie.
Reit da, ni'n meddwl.
O, mae'n nofel anhygoel.
Ie.
O fel bod hi'n dechrau'r 4 ganrif ar 15.
Ie.
Mae un o'r penodau jyst yn sgwar mawr di. Ie.
Ffantastig, ydy? Amrywiaethau, dy.
Sorry. Felly, ti dal e'n wrong, dydi?
I know.
Na da i ddal. Oce, mewn 5.
4, 3. Y rhedais i yn gyflymach ac yn gyflymach rhwng y coed, a'i gweld nhw'n fflachio heibio i mi trwy gornel fy llyged. O'n i fel pe bawn i'n redeg mewn hunlle rhag ryw ddrygioni mawr, ond yn redeg i ddim pwrpas. Roedd y drygioni o'm hwmpas i'n bobman, nid yn unig y tu ôl i mi, ond o'n blaen i, uwchben, o bobti, ym mhobman.
Mae fi.
Okay. Get an idea of it. Kind of slightly. I mean, I cringe slightly at the Tristram Shandy bit in there. But what we were trying to do is we were trying to play with the verticality and what you could do with the vertical frame, at the same time as playing with a certain kind of performativity with the literary source. So it wasn't to be an adaptation, a dramatic performance of it, as it were, because we'd sort of come to the conclusion that we couldn't really do that to that material. We couldn't just turn it into a drama. We had to kind of play with it or disrupt it somehow. And that was the film was attempting to do that and to use agile mobile media making equipment to mobile phones and also that vertical aesthetic in order to do that. Because one of the things about verticality in a frame of that kind was it really disrupted the interplay between foreground and background, really disrupted the interplay between a figure in a landscape. So perhaps there might be a tendency to read that in a picturesque way, and we were trying to force ourselves not to do that. And in this piece, we've also looked at the idea of evolutionary adaptation coming out of a reading of Ingold's work around inside and the outside of texts and entanglement, as well as work by Robert Stamm on adaptation. But we're also looking at the architect Shumi's work around reciprocity, indifference and conflict in spaces, how you can make texts, buildings or other texts that have reciprocity, indifference and conflict to a certain space, so that they could be, in sympathy with that place, they could be in conflict with that place, or ironically in conflict with the place, or in fact quite indifferent to the place. And we were trying to play with gears of reciprocity, indifference and conflict, because we'd found that in the source book, really. We'd found traces of those three elements in that work. So with Uncrinkling then, I think it's it's unfair just to give one example, but as you know, the other some of the unrolling examples were uncrinkling as well. Intuition is definitely there in terms of refining ideas, in terms of following through on something when you're not completely sure why you're doing it, of guiding decisions. So there'll be these thousands of decisions we make in some of these creative projects. How to make decisions? Well, sometimes you just make them and you carry on with them all the way through to the end. There was a review for this in Sightlines, Aspera's online practice research journal, that they didn't like these cut-in moments where we kind of dropped the mask and started talking in a Rob Brydon and Steve Coogan type way about the film. But we kept going, we kept them in anyway, because we felt it was important to kind of break things as much as possible, even if that led to a work that wasn't satisfying or was broken, but that was kind of the point. And so there's lots of iterations going on here intuitively, seeking after something, seeking to get something that works. But also with this production, where there was an awful lot of critical reflection. So we would make something, look at it, redraft over and over and over. There was a lot of broader context coming in from the book itself and the earlier work that we'd done. And there were final decisions made, or suspensions of decisions not to make decisions as well. There. Okay, so I'm coming to my last category. Hooray! Picking process.
We have 10 minutes before we have
10 minutes. But
yeah,
okay.
Including questions and answers. So.
Oh God. Okay. Well, this is quick then. Picking process, working with legacy technology. So the picking process represents this final stage, and it's the newer stage for me. I've got to admit, where practitioners engage with existing technologies that cannot be avoided. I'm going to jump over this slide. You can probably read some of that later if you want to freeze frame it, if you're so inclined, future viewer. To think about this kind of installation. So some of the research I'm involved in at the moment is at a different level, where we're talking about using virtual production technology such as the mocap studio and the virtual production studio at AUT, and working through a new research centre called the Virtual Creative Design Research Centre. So the idea with picking pathways is that you have to face up to the technological realities of what's happening in the world, and that means you have to kind of bite the bullet, as it were. And I mean that with the kind of the colonial undertones of the original meaning of that. That is, you have to kind of take part in a system that perhaps you don't want to, that you have to bargain for technology that to some extent might be obsolete in a few years, but it's very useful now. All those kinds of difficult and kind of slightly uncomfortable positions become things that you have to take up in order to investigate these areas. But how it's worked out for us in AUT is that we've got a faculty-funded research program that is looking at all kinds of aspects of extending this use of these kind of large tech areas. These two installations are full of cameras, the very expensive cameras on very expensive cranes with big computers with large screens. In a way, it's a return to kind of studio-based making, away from agile and democratized making. But we're trying to see how we can avoid some of the obvious tendencies with the scale of work, and this kind of work that really takes maybe filmmaking, media making away from the field to some extent, or away from life. So we've got a range of research projects going through at the moment this year, looking at indigenizing movement, looking at the innovation of the use of virtual production volumes in fiction making, augmented reality-based information systems for supervising. So there's products being made in here. Mahitai in cinematography and acting, so looking at indigenous frameworks of thinking in order to change the way people might behave within a space that might force them down one behavioral route. Thinking outside the volume, so thinking about all kinds of ways of hacking the technology so that it does something other than what it's supposed to be doing. Virtual pepaha, again, another Maori cultural use of the studio that's much more community-based than it would be like perhaps for the precise media making uses that you might use a VP Studio for. Wearable goniometry system, so actually making things that you could wear that would trigger things on the screens. Theatrical previs, using it as a high-tech theatrical space in order to design stages, and then also thinking about bridging physical and digital worlds, investigating how large-scale interfaces replicate spatial sense. So using it as a huge, big sort of a holodeck type thing. So there's all kinds of projects happening in that space, working with the technology as it is, but trying to find other ways around it. And this is all based in this new Virtual Creative Design Research Centre, which I'm shamelessly plugging at the end of this video. But that's the kind of the unpicking process is the point, in a way, of this design research centre, is to kind of look at these processes and really challenge them, pick them apart, but also agree to go with the flow when that is a necessary step that you have to take. And just to finish, if that's one concentric circle out from the research, is to be looking at a research centre, and even further concentric searches, International Journal of Creative Media Research, which also kind of contains that sense as well, right? So which was Agatha and I both were our editors on this, and this is another concentric circle outside again in picking processes. That is, we have to get funding for it. It has to be done by certain dates. It has to be put there, and we have to put CFPs out and manage it, etc. But that's another circle again of going with the flow of systems as they are. But when we're in there, being rebellious and intuitive. And I can't end without saying that there is a special issue about extending virtual production out there, which is going to be, this is terrible podcast practice because this is going to be out of date pretty soon. And more information about the Journal of Creative Media Research can be found on the website. There you go, I'll just put those in there. So picking process, yeah, intuition, collective choices, direction towards needs, a sense of technical through imagination, and investigation, solving technical problems, challenging aesthetic needs and aims, and encountering frameworks of all kinds. And I'll end by going back to these three categories, which I don't know whether you agree with them at all. Are they any use? I don't know. They've helped me get through this presentation anyway, but and they've helped me look back at what I've done before. But I'd be quite interested to know either, you know, now discussion now for a little bit, or even, I don't know if you have comments underneath the video, but it'd be really interesting to know if anybody has anything they want to add to a comment about that structure. And that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dafydd. That was just so interesting. I am so sad that we only have 5 minutes for the questions, because I have about a million of them. And I do want to leave at least a couple of minutes for people in the room to ask questions. But I'm just going to ask one question, and I will ask you plenty outside of this meeting. And yes, the comments for enabled for YouTube. So people might ask questions there as well. When you were talking about the very first project, the one with the monitors, you asked this question: how do you know, does it work? And it was just so interesting to see all these ideas and amazing examples. I'm just really mind blowing in terms of what your process was for that. But all this idea with rolling out, anchoring, and picking process. But then I'm just gonna go back to that question: how do you know, with creative practice research, with this idea of intuition and investigation, at what point do you know that it works? And I know it's a provocative question, and I know there's no answer, but I'm just really curious to kind of, roll it back at you and see what you say.
It's a good question. Okay, so I think it works it works in different ways at different times, I think. So quite early on in a project, I think it's a good idea to kind of decide, I'm going to do that. That's there's an anchor there. Maybe there's more than one anchor. Maybe there'd be a couple of anchors, And you can say, right, I bet is a bit of a gamble in a way. I think with those anchors, whatever happens afterwards, I can post hoc theorize it. I know I'm not maybe not supposed to say that, but I'm big a fan of that. If things emerge afterwards, that's great. Yeah. But at least something will emerge. So if you can set up a couple of anchors into literature or into practice or context, then you're going to be relatively safe, I think. Especially you're spending some of your money and time doing this, so you want to get something out of it. Let's say that, and then I think later on, things start to take on their own movement. And I think at the end it depends on what the project was, what the anchors were, as to what the triggers are that tell you that it's working or not. I think as a creative, you have a little voice in you that tells you that. So part of it is trying to listen to that voice, to locate it and listen to it. And when it says, then you believe it.
I love it.
Really easy not to do that, but I think that's an essential thing. And then at the end, I think you need to cover yourself. When you're publishing it, make sure it goes to a good place. Make sure that you tell lots of people about it. They take it to conferences. Do that kind of looking after it as well, and that can make it work as well. Even if it didn't work in the first place, you might discover that it actually works for other people in a different way.
It's a great answer, and it obviously links to this idea of intuition investigation, but also to autoethnography. I do think we should think about, especially about the idea of how intuition and investigation works in creative media research. But that's again for you and I to talk outside of this meeting. We really have to finish very soon, but I'm just going to ask if there's any. So we probably have time for one question. So is there anyone in the room who wants to ask something about this amazing presentation? Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I'll try and be as quick as I can to fit it in. I find it really interesting how you finished there by saying this framework really helped you in the reflection on your earlier work. And as I was listening to you talk about it, I felt like a lot of these stages that you're picking out at the point of doing the work, they feel very compressed. Like they all run into each other. They kind of merge and overlap, and I feel like this is a really interesting reflective framework. I'm not sure how much it's in the moment framework, because the whole intuition process is you latch on and run, and it's all about momentum and progression. And I don't ever feel like there's and maybe this is a feeling of my own, but I don't ever feel like there's a pause moment where I can sit back and say, oh okay, this is where that framework can actually help me make those decisions. I wonder what you think about that. Is this an after, or do you feel like this is actually something that you could want to be working through as you're making?
So I'm just thinking back to that initial moment when we came up with the idea why. So why do you come up with a kind of theory or a concept anyway? Is to help you in a certain position, isn't it? I think. And so that is of use. And I think what we found with that initial pedagogy study was that we were just jumping to conclusions. We were jumping to assumptions. We were trying to design something around something we didn't know anything about. And so the idea of unfolding something, and then there's other sub-unfoldings. There's probably more sub-unfolding type ideas underneath that we haven't formulated properly yet. What that did was it just helped us have a conversation about it. We said, like, let's unfold that, we would say, or let's think again about this. Let's open that out. Let's slow down a bit. That really helped. And for me, I tend to try and do too many things at the same time. I tend to try go too fast, and partly because what it's like. We've got little bits of pockets of time all over the place. So something that just like maybe it's just simply a mnemonic to kind of say, like, just open it out, have another look at it. But I'm the kind of person who opens the drawer, I can't find something, I have to shut the drawer, open it again, and there it is. I'm afraid. So that suits me. But maybe it doesn't work for everybody. But that's the use for me. It makes me look again. It makes me slow down, and it makes me open out to possibilities, because I think if you're enthralled, for me, if you're enthralled to the kind of scholarship mode where, you know, the more French philosophers you can get per paragraph, the higher the points are. If you're in that mode, then you just shoot over things and you don't really listen to your inner voice and you don't really think about the small things that really matter. So unfolding was maybe another way of opening out something that somebody else had folded. But there is lots of good stuff in there, if only it was opened up. So maybe it's as a metaphor, really, more than anything else.
Yeah, as you say that, it strikes me as that it might be a really nice counter to the that kind of impulse to produce, as you say, within the scholarly mode, where there's the pressure. Where is your next thing? Where is your next production? And as you say, maintaining multiples at the same time and trying to always have something.
Yes.
It's actually a really nice kind of break on that to actually have this unfolding. Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
I actually, you've just made me realise, I think maybe partly came out of something that I heard Eric Clinton saying years ago, which was about, if you're going to do a project, have a project but have lots of outputs, you know, and sort of unfold the thing. So if you're going to do all that work, make sure you make the most of it. So there's also an opening out all the possibility. Make sure because again, as you say, it's you know, that we haven't got much time and there's pressure. But also there's so much value in practice research. There's so much stuff that comes out of even the smallest amount that actually some time you should spend unfolding it, because you'll find all kinds of stuff in it.
It's such a great answer. It really makes me think also, just kind of wrap it up, really, how like much of my work is really about kind of finding or trying to understand what kind of structures we can use that will protect that idea of creative chaos and experimentation, and that's what your talk was really very much about, how these two things work together. I think it's just so important, as you said, like also given the fact that we even have to still worry about the fact how autoethnography might not be perceived as scholarly enough, which is crazy when you think about how can you possibly detach yourself from the creative work which you're making. It is impossible. Thank you so very much, David. We're going to continue this conversation on many levels, I can promise you that. And what I will do, I will make sure this video is published and on YouTube and shared on social media by the end of today. I'll share it with you. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us despite my big confusion about time zones. And next month we have Kaf Dooley, whom you mentioned today. So last Wednesday of May. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy your evening, Dafydd. Thank you so much. It's probably very late where you are right now. And yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. So thank you so very much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye.